So it's probably odd and incongruous then that to many constitutional scholars today, and with respect to the Supreme Court, the Constitution is held as, property rights are held as sort of the poor relations in the constitutional order of things. It certainly would strike the Founding Fathers as odd that property rights are not held in much higher regard. They believed that property rights were a natural right, which I presume all of you are familiar with. It's something that pre-existed government and was one of the rights that government existed to protect. However, the Supreme Court has said that property interests, of course, are not created by the Constitution. In a manner of speaking, that is actually literally true because we believe that they predate the Constitution, but that's not what they meant by that. What they meant is that property rights are something that are created by the government and can therefore be given and taken away, subject to procedural fairness concerns. But they really had no innate property rights that could be consistently applied as a matter of jurisprudence across the board. And again, talking back to my first comment, life, liberty, and property is in the Constitution twice, once you include the 14th Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment actually references property twice, both with life, liberty, and property not being taken under the due process of law, but also that no property can be taken except for public purpose and upon just compensation. We'll talk a little bit about Metro Nashville here in a second and some of the ways they get around property rights with respect to some of my litigation. But, to continue into the theme that I was saying about the Constitution and how the Supreme Court treats property rights, the Supreme Court has held that the government can prohibit individuals from growing wheat for personal consumption, that is within the purview of federal powers. The Supreme Court has said that the government can take your land for the public purpose of giving it to another person who might make a higher or better use of that property, thereby rewarding the citizens with more tax revenue. They've said that governments can require a license to work in professions that do not threaten public health, safety, and welfare. For any of you that are familiar with my litigation, a lot of my litigation is in that realm. Tennessee used to have a license for shampooing hair. Tennessee has required a veterinary license for someone to massage a horse. We currently have a high school requirement for people to become barbers, in the case I'm involved in right now. Tennessee, the last 2 years, has voted on whether to create an art therapy board for the profession of art therapy. If you're wondering what art therapy is, I brought the definition. It means the integrated application of psychotherapeutic principles and methods with specialized training in visual art media to assist individuals, families, or groups to improve cognitive or sensory motor functions, increase self-awareness and self-esteem, cope with grief and traumatic expressions, resolve conflicts, distress, and enhance social functioning. So, I'm sure we all agree that that's a very important professional license to create.
Welfare program for fine arts and social work.
Yeah, and if you actually want to know who's behind this, is the University of Tennessee has an art therapy program that no one's interested in attending. And they think it is because there aren't a licensed art therapy board that would essentially, therefore, require, bingo. The license only takes 1,000 hours in postgraduate art therapy to get it. But if you do not have the good fortune of having your postgraduate degree in art therapy, you can make up for it with a 2,000 hours of clinical experience, provided that you've got some other therapeutic advanced degree. The art therapy bill also comes complete with an art therapy board, the members of which must all be licensed art therapists and who are entitled, that's the actual quote from the bill, to taxpayer-funded expenses or travel and other appropriate expenses. So that's what's going on in the streets. Anyway, suffice it to say that the Supreme Court's treatment of it is out of step with how the founders would have thought of it, because they would have thought of it as a natural right. The Revolution was in many ways a revolt against the idea that the king was the ultimate landlord. And that was a very important concept to them. If you think about it, the king could always take back your land because all land belonged to the crown. And so to the founding generation, they practiced the belief that you could own a land in fee simple, meaning you owned it free and clear and no one could ever take it back from you or encumber it no matter what. That's what all of that stuff about bills of attainder was about, taking away the ability of the government to take away your land that you owned outright. Go ahead.
Question as far as the boundary period, whether in the states, were there, and I don't know if they existed in a certain extent that we have today, were there any kind of precedents for these kind of rules locally or statewide for licensure or any of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So actually, there is a good bit of precedent, not in a good way, meaning that beginning as early as the 13th century, the king was issuing these things that are called patents. Okay, and that's what they called them. You would call it a license. But the king was issuing patents to engage in certain work. So you'd have the patent to be the royal winemaker, the royal tailor. You'd have a patent to be, in fact, a patent that was very famous because it was a landmark English common law case, was a patent to become a doctor. And there actually was a series of litigation where this whole idea that the right to work was a natural right that even a king couldn't surpass. So there's a number of English common law cases where people challenge, they're called like the case of the playing cards, the case of the tailors, the case of the winemakers, but they were all challenging these royal patents. And England developed an idea that every man had a free right to work and it couldn't be arbitrarily taken away or limited. It's directly applicable to the discussions that we have today about professional licensure. And this back and forth between the king ended with something called the Statute of Monopolies, which was a series of laws passed by Parliament that checked the ability of the king to issue these sorts of patents. And by the way, keep that in mind the next time you hear somebody talk about the founding era anxiety about monopolies. Okay, that's what they meant by a monopoly, right? It was something like the East India Trading Company or something like the royal patent to make playing cards. It didn't refer to a large, successful corporation that had a dominant percentage of market share. And you'll sometimes see this come up in some of the discussions where, you know, people who are looking to repurpose the Constitution will say, look, the founders hated corporations and the founders hated monopolies. And that's true, but a monopoly was something very different. And a corporation was essentially a monopoly. In the 100 years ago, most states passed what are called general charters of incorporation, where basically anybody can become a corporation. But before that, it actually literally required a change in the law that gave you a unique status under the law that nobody else had. And so when the founders were talking about corporations, they were really talking about something that looks a lot more like rent-seeking or some kind of exclusive trading privileges that other people wouldn't enjoy. So when you see those founding era things ranting about corporations, that's kind of what it is they're talking about. Anyway, but you know, you'll see property rights sort of kicked around by people, again, looking to repurpose the Constitution by saying, you know, the founders, when they were talking about property rights, were really trying to enshrine their privilege. You know, they were trying to keep a patriarchy or some sort of elitist institutions in place. And that's not true for no other simple fact than property was not the purview of the privileged and elite. Pretty much everybody had property. That was one of the big virtues of coming over to America and becoming an American. You know, one of the reasons why English colonies were successful in the ways that French and Spanish colonies weren't is because they saw it as an entrepreneurial venture. Now think about that, just based on what you know of history. The French wanted waterways. They built forts. They were interested in fur trading. Okay, the Spanish were interested in gold and conversion of souls. So, you know, they built those sort of outposts that were designed to conquer and then minister. But the English were interested in setting up commercial ventures. Plymouth and Jamestown were stock-backed ventures that they sold shares for. And what they were interested in creating was trading partners that they saw as potentially having a long-term greater payoff than short-term thinking like fur trading or mineral extraction. And it goes without saying, at least in America, that that's the model that proved to be the most successful. Well, part of what that required was the people who come here coming and being a stakeholder in the sense that they were going to be property owners themselves. You know, the reason why the Pilgrims were successful, I mean, we know about the religious story, but only 50% of those guys were religious patriots. Most of them were more like economic refugees who are looking for a slice of the pie. And the reason why, and you should definitely go, if you get a chance to, go read some really good books about this Thanksgiving, about the Plymouth colony. Because it really became a model of successful leadership when William Bradford realized that they had to align the economic incentives with the individual property rights of the people who are stakeholders in the community before this community would get off the ground. You know, in the first year, they almost starved to death, and they moved from a system of community-based property ownership to a system of individual-based property ownership. It's really a fascinating story.
So they were all communists before
Yeah, you know, the Puritans that were coming over, you know, originally had that idea, but give William Bradford credit, you know, he quickly had the idea that, look, we need to have, people are more industrious when they own their own property, and Plymouth succeeded for the same reason that communism failed. And along those lines, by the way, one of the other interesting things is they quickly realized that they had to work and respect Native American land rights. And I don't think they're given enough credit for that. When you go back and look at the historical record, you know, there were some uncertain times there in the first few years they're figuring out the relationships with the Indians. But the Indians that ultimately befriended them realized we are stronger with them here as a trading partner and an ally. And likewise, the Pilgrims realized for this to work, we have to respect their land rights, their fish rights, we have to treat them as equals. And they sort of stand out as a notable exception to a lot of the really thoughtless ways in which a lot of New Worlders came there. And in fact, you know, they brokered a peace that lasted nearly 65 years with the native indigenous tribes. And it was King Philip's War was what broke that peace. And it really happened when Plymouth, which was so successful, gave the way to the Boston colony. And the Boston colonists who came there didn't have the shared history that the Plymouth colony had, and were therefore a lot less sensitive to Native American land rights. And that led to a series of historical incidences that ultimately culminated in what became known as King Philip's War. But anyway, I highly recommend learning more about the Pilgrims. I think we should reclaim them as people who are fascinating figures. Saints and Strangers is a movie that Nat Geo puts out every Thanksgiving. It'll be on TV, and it's a really good look at this. Anyway, property rights were not a privilege of the upper class. That's the point that I was trying to make with that. Property was liberty. They didn't see property rights as divisible from liberty. And I think that this should be more self-evident to people than it evidently is. You know, a lot of times we subordinate property rights to other political priorities. Nashville's a great example of that, where that happens. But the founders understood that you couldn't divide property rights from other core political freedoms. Let me give you a series of examples. You know, what would it mean to religious liberty if you didn't have a right to own a church? Think how easy you could interfere with religious liberty if you could interfere with somebody's ability to find a house of worship, own it, and run it as you so pleased. Conversely, what would the right to speech mean if you didn't have a right to a printing press? You know, the ability to own that piece of property and do with it as you please is essential to political freedom. And so, you know, I think that they are correct when they said that we really cannot divide our freedoms and our property. Property is freedom and freedom is property, and they're the same thing. And so, you know, the Beacon Center is one of our priorities as property rights. We work hard on these issues. We've in fact got dedicated space on our webpage called our Property Rights Coalition. If you haven't signed up for it, I encourage you to go just sign up for it. The ways in which we spearhead our property rights initiative are through education, meaning we talk about these issues, legislation, meaning that a lot of times that means taking away we found that the chief assault on property rights tend to come from local governments, to our discussion earlier. And a lot of times right now where we have a state majority legislature that's sensitive to these concerns, we employ that as a means of curbing cities' priority or cities' ability to pass property rights offensive initiatives. And then the third tool we use is litigation. And a lot of our litigation is geared towards protection of property rights when they come under assault from a local government. You can go on our cases webpage and see some of the cases. We represent a home studio owner that was told that they were going to confiscate all of his equipment because it violated a Nashville law that said you can't have a client in your home if you're going to have a home-based business. And this is a, well-respected.
City, but you can't
Yeah,
have a studio.
yeah. That's our line. It's illegal to make Music City in Music City.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. And he's a well-respected music producer, single dad, takes care of his little girl, and he's got a right to make a living. And if you tell him he can't do this with his home, you're telling him he can't work. We challenge Metro Nashville's inclusionary zoning laws. For those of you who aren't familiar with what inclusionary zoning is, it is when a city conditions a city-owned permit or discretionary benefit on somebody building, selling, and pricing a home that they own at below market rates as determined by Nashville. As libertarians, you should be well aware of what that does to the economics of home building. It's pretty economically illiterate, but on top of it, it's unconstitutional. Why is it unconstitutional? Well, we rely on this concept called unconstitutional conditions. This should give you guys all encouragement, but the Supreme Court has said one thing that cities and governments can't do is condition things on people surrendering a constitutional right. So one example would be the city of Nashville doesn't have to give you a right to have a political rally on the courthouse green. They own that property, it's theirs. But if they're going to give you a permit to do that, they can't say, and by the way, at the end of this, you have to say, vote for so-and-so, or hold up an abortion is murder sign. Now, a lot of people think, Metro Nashville thinks, we don't have to give anybody a building permit, so we can attach whatever conditions on it we want to. And that is the same thing as telling somebody, I am taking your property and putting it to this dedicated public use, and I'm not compensating you for it. And the problem is the Fifth Amendment says you can't do that. It's the same thing as knocking down someone's home to build up a road or a school, but not compensating them for it. It's essentially an involuntary waiver of a constitutional right. We've got a similar unconstitutional conditions case right now, and this goes directly to the housing thing, challenging Metro Nashville's sidewalk law. Nashville wants sidewalks. That's fine. Nothing wrong with sidewalks. Building sidewalks is an appropriate city purpose. Nashville doesn't want to pay for those sidewalks because sidewalks are expensive. So what Nashville does is say that before you can have a building permit to build a home, you have to agree to build Nashville city sidewalks for them and then give that to Nashville. You can also get out of this by simply sending Nashville a bag full of money, and they can go build city sidewalks in another part of the city. I mean, that's an unconstitutional condition.
And even with that, even if you're adding onto your own home, that still applies. You need to build it. There was a case where somebody was on a corner street and they wanted to add a garage, but they had to build an entire corner of sidewalk there, which is going to cost double the amount of the garage.
Yes. Yeah. If you know who that person is, I'm happy to talk to them, by the way.
Yeah.
And they've changed the law to take rid of the renovation piece.
Okay.
So that one of the more objectionable components is now gone, but there may be a way that your friend, whoever this is, can get whatever property it is back.
Okay.
So let me know about that. But these are some of the ways in which local governments get around or think lightly of people's property rights. So that's one of the ways we work on this is through litigation. Next year, we're going to be running a number of property rights initiatives, including we're going to run a Permit Freedom Act. And a Permit Freedom Act, the cities don't have to give people permits, but if they give you a permit or deny you a permit, you have the ability to challenge that as an arbitrary exercise of power, which oftentimes they are. One of the ways that cities react to this is just by not giving a decision period or on any fixed time frame. And if you're in the business of trying to develop property, delay can be the same thing as a no, but a delay is not challengeable. And so giving people a vested statutory ability to require an up or down in writing in a specified period of time, and then a specified ability to have that reviewed by a court, is something that we think is a critical piece of restoring people's property rights that we're interested in seeing doing. So those are some of the ways in which we work on the property rights initiatives. Always glad to have people's interest on the subject, because I do think it's important and overlooked in our current dialogue.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about what you guys had done around Airbnb in the past, and to some degree, like, that was one of the interesting conversations that I had with somebody who's definitely a kind of an entrepreneurial but civil rights activist. Like, she now decided to go from nonprofit to be a realtor, but her whole shtick is now, like, how can she be more inclusive and allow folks that aren't traditionally in the Airbnb space, particularly minorities, how can they leverage Airbnb themselves, which is amazing, to be able to build off of their property wealth. And I know you guys had done some work on that.
Yeah, we did do a lot of work on home sharing, is what the word we use to describe it. Home sharing is a long history in America. Most of the founding fathers actually stayed in boarding houses during the Constitutional Convention. Abraham Lincoln stayed in boarding houses when he went to Springfield, Missouri. He stayed in boarding houses when he went to Congress. Boarding house solutions are not new. Near the turn of the century, I think the number I saw, I'm rusty on my home sharing facts, but in Manhattan it was something like 7 in 10 people lived in the home of another person. There were remarkably diverse arrangements even then. They gave homes and entrepreneurial opportunities to immigrants and women, a lot of other people who otherwise didn't have access to it. And in fact, in the Jim Crow South, one of the ways that people got around Jim Crow was this thing called the Green Book, which was kind of a precursor to Airbnb, but it was a printed copy of people's homes that you could stay in when you were driving cross country. And I do think it's fascinating that even in Jim Crow South, local governments didn't think they had the ability to go that far as to tell people, you're not allowed to have certain people in your home. One way of looking at this is we've just had a broad national debate that I think is settled, saying that nobody really has the ability to tell somebody what they do in the privacy of their own bedrooms. Yet somehow we think that local governments in particular have the ability to tell people what they're going to do in the privacy with their own bedrooms. And what's really changed there, other than a preposition? Any government that can tell you how long you can have a guest is a government that can pretty much tell you anything. But these home sharing waves were sort of prompted by a wave of mostly hysteria, driven over the anxiety of people opening up their homes to what was putatively a commercial purpose. I somewhat dispute the idea that this is even a commercial purpose to begin with. Nobody thinks that if I want to have a long-term renter, that is a renter of over 30 days, that suddenly makes this a business, as opposed to just something that you do with your home. And the lawyerly word for this, when you take property rights, you learn that when you own property, the old English expression is you own a bundle of sticks, meaning that it comes with a lot of related subordinate usage that come with ownership of the property rights. And one of those bundle of sticks was the ability to rent or lease or subordinate use those properties. So I do think this marked a big shift in the ability of local government zoning laws when they suddenly started to crack down on these things. I'm sensitive to the concerns that residents have about one of these things that are coming in there, but bad neighbors are kind of a fact of life. You can have a bad long-term resident. The difference is they're not going to leave for a year. And cities know how to treat these things, and it's with the enforcement of the police powers, noise, parking ordinances, those sort of things.
Airbnb is far less likely to become a meth house.
Right, yeah. So, we took litigation on behalf of some pioneers in the community for home sharing. They were just a young Nashville couple that this basically helped them pay their mortgage in a neighborhood that they otherwise would have struggled to make
less power, have less money, essentially to be able to fight these cases. Because this is one of the things I appreciate about Beacon is a lot of times you represent, like with the hair braiding instance,
Sure.
like there's so many things that you guys are doing that are representing people that typically don't have the same privilege to just spend an enormous amount of money on representation that you guys are doing, particularly around property rights. Or what are the areas that you think like are most interesting in ways that you guys want to move in?
Well, I think property rights is it, actually. So the topic is apropos of that discussion. We really see a big space that isn't occupied in terms of reform of local land use laws. Local governments are kind of overlooked by a lot of advocacy and issue-oriented groups like ours. Tend to focus mainly on federal solutions, which I think is a mistake. Lately, people have been better about state solutions, but there's still not a lot of energy focused around local solutions. And I really think there's a lot of opportunity there, both for reform and from a litigation perspective. But I think the educational piece is huge too. You know, there's a big tendency, particularly among folks on the right, to just write off cities. And this is happening as cities are failing in some of their most basic functions. It occurs to me that, you know, in a day and age where it's basically unaffordable for the vast majority of America to live in San Francisco, or when New York City can no longer fund and maintain its otherwise impressive public transit infrastructure, that there's a whole lot of people that might be open to free market ideas that were previously not. And we need to be spending time and energy going in there and talking to those people. You know, why is it that the least affordable cities in America are ones that are dominated by progressive city councils who pass and pile on restrictive zoning laws? Look, I don't think San Francisco is racist by any stretch of the imagination in terms of what its city politics are, but there's no doubt that its land use laws have had the effect of instituting an aggressive form of segregation. And you can just go look at the census numbers. If I thought to bring them, I have them back in my office. But you know, you can see the minority share of a population dropping across the board in the city of San Francisco as the decades increase. And it's increasingly true in a lot of cities. It'll happen in Nashville if the present trajectory continues. Go ahead.
A couple of questions on Airbnb. I tend to be in favor of it, but one concern that I've heard that I haven't seen a good answer to is the volatility that Airbnb exposes others in the neighborhood property values. And the related question to that is, are there, and I hate to use the word, are there regulations that could be brought in with that to reduce that volatility?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think those regulations already exist, right? Like, we know what to do with loud neighbors, right? We shut them down. There's noise violations. There's parking violations. There's all those kind of things. And you know, interestingly, like the platform, the best way to police these things is really with the cooperation of the platforms, because they have the ability to have access to so much information about who are the good ones and who are the bad ones. And you know, a lot of that already goes on just through their user ratings and all those kind of things. But in the other cities other than Nashville, the platforms actually have contracts with the cities to essentially police on behalf of the city, such that when you have noise complaints or parking violations, they can almost take care of that in real time with the actual renters and the property owners. Nashville doesn't have that arrangement because they've been so hostile with the platforms that they haven't entered into those agreements.
As a follow-up to that, though, does it affect property values? Has it shown to affect property values?
Yeah, you know, that's an area would be great. There's a great opportunity for some research. I'd love to kind of know that. I will say from my standpoint, from litigation, I can tell you what the city tells me. And the city has told me both that it is destroying property values, and that's why they need to do this, because it's ruining neighborhoods, and it's destroying access to affordable housing because all of these things are getting bought up and turned into short-term rental properties. Now, it cannot possibly be true that it is simultaneously destroying and inflating property values. But the city of Nashville will put both of them in the same legal brief.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha.
And think nothing of it.
Nobody knows at this point.
I think that there is some research out there. I don't know how good the research is, and it'd be worth a good hard
that
look.
I've seen, just to wrap that up, like I think like primarily, particularly in Nashville, like it's not been detrimental to like your actual homeowner property price. It's actually like you can make it better argument that it's raised property prices than the opposite.
And of course, if it's raising it, again, it goes back to our supply and demand problem.
Exactly.
Right? Like if there really is so much pressure to take these homes and convert them to short-term rental usages, that's a supply and demand problem. And there's a lot of individual evidence out there suggesting the highest and best use for these properties is expanded ability to utilize one's own property in a more liberty-friendly fashion.
Like for me to even have like a garage in the backyard, like I have to go get that approved by my Metro Councilman. Like he has to be able to bring that forward and go through that process, even regardless of what it has to do with my neighbors or whatever. Like it doesn't matter. It still has to go through this long, arduous process. And and in the part of town that I live in, there's also historic overlays, and so you're not even allowed at that point to be able to do that in a lot of those.
So you shouldn't be allowed to assess property taxes on you if you have an overlay, in my opinion. Go ahead.
This might be more of a philosophical rather than a legal question, but as far as property value, is there? I think there is, but is there a difference between your right to property value as opposed to the right to property, and are people stealing from you, as I've heard it put, if they do something that quote unquote lowers your value, your property value?
Yeah. I think that's a fair point, and it's one that needs to be thought about more deliberately. We were talking about just the general expectation that people view their homes as store of wealth, as something that has all kinds of downstream adverse policy effects. There's no reason why your home has to be your store of wealth, but people kind of view that as an investment and an expectation. But, as a core property rights principle, where does your property right begin and end? And if you're talking about the right to exclude somebody else from committing a use that they might otherwise like to do, I think we need to think seriously about where that assumption leads us. Because, of course, there's all sorts of reasons why somebody might think to inflate their property value by telling you what you can and can't do with your property.
Yeah, and for us, I mean, for the LP particularly, I think that there's room for debate on, should you have a club right next to your house? I mean, that's going to be open at 3 a.m. There's a space there where there's an infringement upon your rights, essentially, to be able to live peacefully. But then, that has been taken to some kind of extreme degree that's been completely ridiculous, where it's not actually, it's it's the thing that frustrates me is most is the eyesore thing. People use that consistently.
Right.
And even recently, and Metro Council, and only one person voted against this, was this idea to stop allowing people to have tire shops in one of the districts because they don't like the look of it. They said it was health reasons. If you read the bill, it says health. But no one actually said that. No one was worried about the health in this actual Metro Council meeting. They said, I just see tires, and I don't like that.
Yeah.
Basically, was what was said, and that was Colby Sledger's district. If you want to jot that down, but in the same place where the soccer stadium was being developed. But that's the place where there is a conversation to be had. As okay, are you actually are you putting gross smells in my property? Are you putting loud sounds? Are you having other things that are going to affect my daily life, or do you just not want this particular type of business?
Yeah. And along those lines, by the way, land use law is not something that came down on stone tablets. In fact, at the founding, and really actually until well near in the 20th century, zoning and all that kind of stuff really didn't exist. This is all a very, very new concept in the grand scheme of things. Historically, if it was your property, it was your property. And, the exception to that was governed by what's called common nuisance doctrines. So, you could do whatever you want to with property, but you didn't have the right to dump paint and turpentine in the stream that everybody else was using. That was a common nuisance. And then we started to develop a more, they would have said, enlightened way of approaching this, which was zoning. We're going to put the businesses over here, we're going to put, light industrial uses here, and so on and so on. It reached its apex with the idea that there's just going to be this thing called residential zoning. And it's going to be really, really low density. And the whole point of this is to just make it peace and quiet. But the end point of that was that people have a right to pass laws that can stop harmless uses of property just purely based on aesthetic considerations. And we should question whether or not there is even a government role in the exercise of its police powers and just saying, I don't like the way that looks, it's going to stop. Go ahead.
First of all, just make a comment that's interesting. We live in a townhouse area with HOA, and the interesting thing is we're talking about HOA meaning about rentals and how property values are going up to the point now where using the property as a rental is actually becoming cost prohibitive, which is just free markets.
Right.
The question I had was about, is there anything legally with HOAs and Airbnb?
Well, see, the problem is that an HOA is a private contractual arrangement. I would never be a member of an HOA for all of the reasons that I never want to live in a totalitarian state. But you've essentially contracted to be a part of this totalitarian system, and so they can pass, subject to very few exceptions, pretty much whatever they want to. And become the totalitarian, right.
You become president of the HOA and something that we do everything.
But so what you're saying is that basically they can do whatever they want.
It's a contractual arrangement. It's like becoming a member of a club, having your employer setting terms of your employment, those kind of things.
How does that work legally? Trying to move into a neighborhood. I remember maybe it was part of the closing documents. On that stack.
Well, I don't. Are there HOAs in public neighborhoods?
In my subdivision.
Are you sure it's a public neighborhood?
When you say public neighborhood.
Well, I thought public neighborhood was the word you used. What was your original question?
When you move in one, you're not signing, as it says, contractual arrangement. I don't remember signing anything saying I agree to these HOA.
It probably was in whatever it was you signed that said, this is an HOA and I'm subject to the HOA.
But it's my property, and when
You're essentially saying, how does it get to run with the land? Right? Like, why doesn't, if I never agreed to it, why doesn't it run with the land? But I think